Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 12th of July of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Zolochiv direction on the Kharkiv front line. The Russians continue bombing and attacking the Ukrainians along the borderlands. Now that this direction is very interesting because almost every single week we got additional updates from this territory. One day the Russians are bombing this territory, another day the Russians are sending reconnaissance and sabotage group, another day the Ukraine FPV drone attacked the Russian forces on the territory of Russian Federation. So lots of activities, but one we can say for sure that for now there is no full-scale offensive operation neither from the Russian side nor from the Ukrainian. So there are still very heavy clashes, but without any changes on the ground, and most likely the Russians are waiting the end of the Vovchansk battle or the end of the battle for Lyptsy. As for Lyptsy, the situation for the Ukrainians is becoming very difficult in the farms. If you remember, during the previous days the Ukrainians managed to improve their positions and to capture the farms that located in the northern part of Hlyboke. They captured this territory, and from the first days, from the first seconds of that Ukraine offensive operation, the entire plan looked good, because the Ukrainians were trying to cut the northern supply road, and after that their plan was to expand, to develop their positions further in the southern direction and to force the Ukrainians to fall back. Furthermore, not just to force the Russians to force the Russians to fall back, not just to force the Russians to fall back, but to push them to the main supply roads, the only supply roads between Hlyboke and the village of Marachavets and Alinikova, to this road. We will discuss this in a minute. But when the Ukrainians captured the farms, after that they made lots of attempts to attack the Russian forces, but all those attacks were repelled by the Russians. The Ukrainians suffered significant losses, and now the situation is that the Ukrainians are no longer able to concentrate the critical mass or additional group to restore their offensive from this tree line. The problem is that the main forces the Ukrainians are concentrating in this area, because using this road, using these tree lines is the only safe road that Ukrainians can use for sending their forces inside of the farms and of course inside of Hlyboke. But the problem is that this is the only road, and that's why the Russians don't need even to think much, to think a lot, because they know exactly where to attack, which area to bomb, and they can do this anytime they like, and always they will hit somebody or destroy something. So this is the main reason, and basically we can make a conclusion that Ukrainians who are currently located in Hlyboke and in the farms are operationally encircled. But the thing is that the Russians are in the same situation. They are inside of Hlyboke. Probably they have more reliable positions because there are lots of buildings. Maybe the Russians managed to dig in deeper. The Ukrainians in the farms have less good positions because there are very big distances between each building, and there are lots of Russian drones. Obviously this territory is covered with the Russian electronic warfare equipment, and there is not so many Ukrainian electronic warfare equipment that can reach this territory. So summarizing everything, the Russians have more favorable positions. But the problem is that Ukrainians also have established complete FPV drone control over the main supply road that goes from this small forest belt towards the next defense forest belt that located in 1.5 kilometers. So for the Russians, if they have wounded, or if they need additional munition or water, just the bullets or something like this, they need always to use this road. And the problem is that this territory is under complete Ukrainian FPV drone control. Everything that goes in this direction obviously will be bombed by the Ukrainians or will be attacked by the Ukrainian FPV drones. And telling the truth, the Russians are suffering significant losses. For example, in this video we can see another evacuation group of Russian forces. As you can see, the Russians don't have possibilities to use armored vehicles for these purposes. They can evacuate soldiers, wounded soldiers, just on their own feet. And as you can see, the Ukrainians control the territory and they attacked that evacuation group, and the Russians suffered additional losses. So this road is under complete Russian control, and this road is under complete Ukraine control, and this road is under complete Russian control. So now it's just a question who has, let's say, more better logistic, better supply, and who can suffer more problems or, let's say, bad situation, the Russians or the Ukrainians. For example, if we increase the numbers of updates since the beginning of months, we're going to see significant number of FPV drones, as you can see, among the fields between Marachovets, Krasne, Alinikovo, and Hlyboke itself. The Russians during the previous weeks during the previous days made lots of attempts to send forces, mainly to send tanks and armored vehicles with the purpose to break through the Ukrainian defense belt in farms and to force the Ukrainians to abandon these positions. But the Ukrainians control this territory, as we discussed, with FPV drones, and the Ukrainians control this territory with artillery. For example, today the Ukrainians published a video of how they repelled another attempt from the Russian side to redeploy or to bring some reinforcement. As you can see, a significant number of armored vehicles, tanks, personnel carriers were destroyed as a result of Russian attempt to bring additional batch of troopers. So this is the current situation, but on the other hand, we see that the Russians, they have some benefits. They have FAB 3000. For example, in this video we can see that how the Russians managed to discover another Ukrainian temporary position, and as a result of FAB strike, that building was completely destroyed, basically reduced to ruins. Later, the group of forces north stated that as a result of this attack, this bomb, the Ukrainians lost up to 100 soldiers. Furthermore, the Russians are saying that there were around 10 officers among those 100 soldiers. Now let's move to Vovchansk direction. We have additional updates, and probably the most important one is coming from Aggregate plant. As you can see, we have adjusted the map and we have colored the Aggregate plant for 100% control of Russian forces. Today we got geolocation. Today we got a video that confirms complete Russian control over this territory. And this video was published by the Ukrainian sources. In this video we can see a Russian soldier who was moving somewhere in the vicinity of buildings along Vovcha river. Pay attention to these pipelines, to this construction. If we zoom in, we're gonna see this construction here. So based on the geolocation, based on the video, we can make a conclusion that the Russian soldier was moving something like this from Vovcha river in the northern direction. Let's return back to this video. We see the Russian soldier who was moving from the south in the northern direction with probably some support, with some bag, with munition, or maybe with food. After him, we can see another Russian soldier who was moving between the buildings. So as you can see, the Russians are feeling themselves pretty safe, and the third soldier in a row. The Ukrainians were conducting reconnaissance operations, trying to discover the main positions of the Russians, and in the final part of that video we might see how the Ukrainians were bombing the Russian positions. So based on this video, once again, the Russian soldier was moving like this, and mainly they were moving towards this building. Once again, this is the road, and this road confirms control over at least 5 buildings. This building, this building, this, and this. And based on this video, we have adjusted the map. Now, and also this update, this control over Aggregate plant confirms and give us more evidence and more food for discussion about possible Russian progress in the southern part of Vovchansk. If you remember, during the previous days we got lots of reports about additional Russian progress. Today, pro-Russian sources continue confirming that piece of news, that the Russians managed to cross Vovcha river and to establish control over some streets and buildings in the southern part. And today, more pro-Russian sources continue doing this. So now this is very interesting, because as we can see and as we discussed in the previous updates, the thing that Ukrainians were expecting and the thing that Ukrainians were trying to achieve is not to be defeated in Vovchansk before NATO summit and probably during the NATO summit. But after NATO summit ended, we see that Ukrainians were broken completely, and now we start receiving more and more updates about more and more progress, about additional progress of the Russians in the southern part of the village, of the city of Vovchansk. As for the Ukrainians who are currently located or were located in the vicinity of the citadel, we got more and more updates during the day that they also start withdrawing their positions in the southern direction. The group of forces north stated that today the Ukrainians made more attempts to cross Vovcha river, but the Russians of course control the river itself. There is not the river is not so big, and always when you see additional batch of Ukrainian forces, the Russians send FPV drones or artillery strikes, and as a result of another attempt to cross the river, the Ukrainians lost up to 30 soldiers. On the other hand, the Russians increased their pressure or began pushing the Ukrainians in the eastern part, so we can say that the days of northern Vovchansk are numbered. Most likely, maybe even before the end of the weekend, the Russians will establish complete control over the territory, and then the real battle is going to start in the southern part. We haven't received anything about the Russian foothold on the eastern side of Seversky Donetsk River. No reports about any clashes. Maybe the Russians took a small silence, took a small pause, media pause, because maybe they're about to bring us significant results, significant updates about additional progress, and maybe about the clashes somewhere in the vicinity of Sinelnikova or Tsehelny or Prilipka. Let's wait, because as I understand, during the next few days, few weeks, the most important updates are going to come exactly from this direction, or maybe from this direction. We'll see. Now we are moving further in Kupiansk, northern Kupiansk direction. Today the Russian sources published another video of how they were trying to bomb and to destroy another bridge, another sand bridge between left and right bank of the left and the right bank of Oskol River. Of course, the Russians managed to damage it, but obviously the Russians can't destroy it because it's just the land, it's just the sand. Maybe the Russians managed to reduce its possibilities, its crossing possibilities, but most likely after this explosion, maybe in 2 or 3 hours, the Ukrainians restored the bridge and began sending more and more forces. So once again, the Russians have just one way how to collapse logistic, and we are talking about the situation when the Russians are, let's say, in 5, in 4, in 3 kilometers from the river itself. So if the Russians are able to get this line only from this perspective, from this configuration, they will be able to collapse the entire defense. Until the Russians in the distance of more than 50 kilometers, the Ukrainians can sleep safe, can sleep well, without any, let's say, any problems, or without any expectations of any some trick from the Russian side. Maybe only pipeline operation can ruin the Ukrainian safe nights. Now let's move in the southern Kupiansk direction. We have additional updates from the village of Makeivka. The Russians continue bombing the territory. For now, we don't have reports about complete control over this small village. Maybe the Ukrainians have redeployed additional forces. Maybe the Ukrainians have redeployed the forces of 3rd Azov Brigade, who was redeployed recently on entire central and the southern Kupiansk direction. So now the 3rd Azov is something like secure team, something like a rescue team that moves from one line of combat contact to another, with the purpose to stabilize the situation and not to allow the Russians to achieve significant progress. As for Siversk direction, today the Russian sources published the video, not the Russians but the locals from Lyman published the video of a very heavy explosion somewhere in the borders of the town. Currently we don't know for sure where exactly the explosion took place, just the author stated that it happened in Lyman today. The Russians using Iskander attacked and destroyed another temporary position of armored forces of Ukraine. Another strike took place, another explosion, very heavy explosion took place in Konstantinivka. Also, this video was published by the locals. In this video we can see the very big consequence, very heavy explosion and huge consequences of a Russian strike. Most likely the Russians destroyed some temporary position or the concentration of forces, and very likely tomorrow the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation will provide us additional updates about the results of this attack, or maybe we're going to receive the same video, maybe but from another angle. Now let's move. We will not discuss Chasiv Yar because we haven't received anything from this direction. We got lots of updates from New York, Donetsk agglomeration. The Russians continue offensive operation, and currently the situation in Donetsk, Pivnishny, New York is the same as we used to see in Vovchansk until tomorrow. The thing is that during the first days of Vovchansk offensive operation, of Donetsk offensive operation, the Russians managed to establish significant control over significant territories. Just for statistics, just for your understanding, let's move back for a second to Vovchansk. As you can see, this line of combat contact in Staritsa, Burgruvatka, Hatishna, Agurtsova, and Volchansk itself, we've been seeing this line of combat combat contact probably since 20th of May. There were almost no changes on the ground for the previous 2 months. So during the first 2 days, from 10th of May till 20th of May, the Russians established this foothold. After that, the Ukrainians managed to concentrate their forces. They managed to bring 36th Brigade, 125th Brigade, Loot Brigade. The Ukrainians managed to bring 57th Brigade and many other different forces, and that's allowed the Ukrainians to stop the Russian movement until the 12th of July, when the Russians captured completely Aggregate plant and crossed the river. So now we can see the same story, the same situation in Donetsk, New York agglomeration. During the first days of very successful pipeline operation, when the Russians managed to break the first defense belt of armed forces of Ukraine, the Ukrainians managed to stabilize the situation by redeployment of the 95th Air Assault Brigade, 41st Brigade, 32nd Brigade, and of course Loot Brigade. And now, because of concentration of forces, the Russians have problems with moving further. There are very heavy clashes. The Ukrainians have a lot of forces, the Russians have a lot of forces, and now the main purpose for both sides is to destroy as many as possible. Only after either the Russians or the Ukrainians are able to damage or to destroy the critical mass, only after that either the Russians and the Ukrainians are able or will be able to move further in any direction. Of course, currently the situation develops in Russian favor, because the thing is that the Russians captured the main defense belt in this area, in this direction, and now the Ukrainians in the side of counter-offensive forces, as if they were attacking the Russians in defense. As for New York, the battle for the main citadel of this town has started. We are talking about the industrial zone that located in the central part of this town. The Russians began bombing this territory with FABs, with different artillery. So this is something like artillery preparation. I'll remind you that during the previous few days, the Russians captured the Petrovska Gora. Yet we haven't received any geolocations confirming this, just reports from reliable sources like pro-Ukrainian mappers or neutral mappers. But anyway, summarizing everything and trying to calculate the distance between possible Russian positions in Petrovska Gora and the heart of New York offensive operation, this industrial zone, the distance between possible Russian position and Ukrainian is less than 400 meters. So it's nothing. And for example, report about the Russian control in Petrovska Gora, about this configuration of control, we received yesterday in the evening, probably this morning, in very early morning. So very likely that the Russians during the day managed to improve their positions even further. And who knows, maybe there are very heavy clashes already on the territory of, let's say, railway station, or on the territory of additional buildings somewhere here on the street of Zarichna Vulitsa, Zarichna streets, or Petrovskova street. So we don't know for sure. Maybe tomorrow we're gonna receive additional updates. But anyway, as you can see, even from this perspective, the Russians already control around 40% or even 50% of this stronghold. Now let's move to the western Avdiivka direction. As we can see, we have adjusted the map. We will discuss this in details. First, let's talk about the northern direction. The pro-Ukrainian mappers stated that during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions and to get as close as possible to the first main defense belt in the southeastern part of Vozdvizhenka. So as soon as the Russians are able to capture this territory, then the battle for Vozdvizhenka, real battle, is going to start. Most likely the Ukrainians will not count their losses, will not count reserves they have. They will send everything they have but to hold Vozdvizhenka, because this is not just a village, like even it's not, this Vozdvizhenka may be even more important than Krasnogorovka, let's say, or even New York, because this is not just, this is like a symbol. This is the symbol of the last defense of Ukrainians before the Russians are able to establish control over the N32 road between Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka. This is a very important barrier. This is a very important layer of defense of armed forces of Ukraine. And if Ukraine lose this territory, this can lead to significant consequences, at least in the minds of Ukrainian soldiers. Now let's move further, and as you can see, once again, we have adjusted the map. We have colored the fields, tree lines, fortifications between Voshod and Novoselivka Persha. First, we got reports from different mappers, neutral mappers, that the Russians captured this territory, and that by the morning, by the late evening of 11th of July or early morning of the 12th of July, the Russians managed to reach this line. And this line was the Russian edge positions, and the Russians were preparing to attack, to begin the final attack towards Novoselivka Pirshe from northwest, from north, from northeast. And this morning, probably a few hours later, we got the first report about control over the territory. Pro-Russian sources reported that as a result of offensive, the Russians managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt and to capture the stronghold, this stronghold, to capture the farms and to capture the school that located in the central part Novoselivka Pirshe. And based on this video, most of the mappers have adjusted their maps. We were expecting for additional updates, and these somewhere at 4 or 5 p.m. of the local time, maybe earlier, we got the video published by the Ukrainian sources. And in this video, there are lots of episodes of FPV drone strikes all over the entire territory of Ukraine, not just in Urozhaine, Krasnogorovka, Novoselivka Pirshe, and many other different towns and settlements. And one of the episodes was geolocated in this area, how the Russians were moving towards the farm and how the Ukrainians were FPV droning the Russians with grenades. And based on that video, most of the mappers have adjusted their maps. So as you can see, the battle for Novoselivka Pirshe has started. The Ukrainians show no resistance because they understand it's not a very good idea to fight in the area that was already cut from the mainland. And now the Ukrainians are trying to organize not even defense, but a small logistic hub in the western part of the village with the purpose to organize centralized evacuation further in direction of Kamyshivka. They can't evacuate every single soldier at once. They need time. They need to do this with the small batches. But the main problem is that the Russian drones are already above the territory of the main logistic. So the Russians control this territory without any problems. We continue receiving additional updates of heavy clashes in this area. And this is very interesting triangle square, because there are lots of Ukrainian drones and there are lots of Russian drones. The purpose of Russian drones, we understand. They want to control the foothold, they want to control the rotation evacuation process and to attack the Ukrainians while they're less protected during the crossing of the river or these water barriers. So to support the Ukrainians, in this territory, they also send significant number of drones whose main purpose is to be like a shield, not to allow the Russians to get close to this territory. Maybe they have some radars, some communication equipment with the purpose to control the drones in the entire area. So this is a very interesting episode when the Russians try to bring down the Ukrainian drones in this area with the purpose to clear the territory and to establish complete control over these fields with the purpose to establish operational encirclement or even a cauldron for those Ukrainians who are currently located between the fields and Mizhova and Novoselivka itself. Now let's move further in the southern direction. We continue receiving reports about Krasnogorovka. During the previous update, we discussed that according to some pro-Russian sources, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation during the previous 24 hours, managed to establish complete control over the central part, over around most part of the northern part. So the Russians managed to capture significant territories inside of Krasnogorovka, or something like this was captured by the Russians, and we were expecting about these updates from different mappers like pro-Ukraine or neutral, but during the day we haven't received anything that can confirm this information. So that's why we're not going to change the map. We're going to wait for additional updates. But anyway, it doesn't mean that the information is wrong. Maybe we're going to receive these reports tomorrow when different mappers will update their maps as a result of clashes for a day. Now let's move further. We have additional and very important updates from Konstantinivka. The important is that the Russians published additional batch of videos of how they were FPV droning the Ukrainians that were using the main supply road between Ugledar and Konstantinivka itself. And this is just, we are using this video just to confirm that this road is no longer safe for the Ukrainians, and basically the Russians already established complete control over this territory, distance control with drones, but this is also very important. The Ukrainians suffer losses. Now we're moving to Urozhaine. Today the Russian sources published the video how they raised the flag in the central part of this small village. This territory used to be in the contested area, but now due to this geolocation, due to this video, we have adjusted the map and colored this territory under complete Russian control. There are still lots of buildings, streets and fortifications under Ukraine control in the northern part, but it's just the time. It's just a matter of time when the Russians are able to capture the village completely. Furthermore, according to the Russian sources, they resumed attempts to attack, so that control over the central part wasn't something like one-time activity from the Russian side. This is the beginning or renewing of full-scale attempts to attack in the northern direction with the purpose to establish complete control over the village and to begin the battle for the next strongholds in this direction. We're talking about Makarovka and Blagodatne. As for Zaporozhye, we haven't received anything important, as well as about Kherson direction. So regular activity, the Russians are bombing the Ukrainians in the vicinity of Kyzyomys, the Russians are bombing the Ukrainians in the vicinity of Novoselivka, the Russians are bombing the Ukrainians with FAPs, with artillery, with FPV drones. The Ukrainians suffer losses, and due to the geolocations and number of updates we received from Ukrainian side, we see that Ukrainians are not showing any resistance, and it's not very difficult to understand. Some sources are saying that the Russians managed to improve their electronic warfare equipment significantly. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.